And we are back for the Thousand Worlds Book Club, and we're talking about The Glass Flower. The link for the story is below, and I am joined by Patchface.
Under the sea, the salmon is smoked, and herring is filled with salt. I know, ho ho ho.
The Glass Flower was published in 1986, and it's actually the last story George R.R. Martin published that takes place in the Thousand Worlds universe. Although later he did begin a novel called Avalon that was set aside for Ice and Fire. The Glass Flower stands apart from the other stories in the Thousand Worlds universe a bit, as it's not that independent. It doesn't just take place in the universe, but it's in many ways about the Thousand Worlds universe. In the background of the other stories, we've heard about a pantheon of legendary characters that have shaped the man realm. We have Erica Storm-Jones and Radjean Tober, Lilith, Celia Marsayan, Deirdre d'Alarain and her ghost twin, Lamila Bayless, Tomo and Wahlberg, Stephen Cobalt Northstar. Some we know a little about, like Lamila Bayless and Tomo and Wahlberg, but for most, we don't know much. The Glass Flower grabs one of these legendary characters and creates an entire story around him. We finally find out about Clarin. But the story is not just about him, it's about body swapping. We see exactly where George R. R. Martin first started to explore the idea of second lives. In fact, the term second lifetime is used in this story. And the story is not just Freaky Friday. No, the story is about the blending of consciousness and a full exploration of what the soul is. It's definitely hard not to think about Bran working Summer and not knowing where Bran ends and Summer begins.
Under the sea, all the soup is frozen in ice. I know, ho ho ho.
So our story begins with our protagonist Sirene, who runs a game. She is a body swapper who has lived on many worlds. Now I've tried to make sense of her travels and geography a bit. She says she was born on Ash, which we don't know anything about. But then she moves to Erican, which is probably named after Erica Storm-Jones, which is in the Celian Cluster, which is probably named after Celia Marsayan. Now the Celian Cluster is likely near the Tempter's Vale, as they once went to war with a Vale world called Dam Tulian. She then heads to some world called Sham Dazar, and then Rogue's Hope, which is also in the Celian Cluster, and then to Vagabond. Vagabond is definitely in the Jambles on the other side of Avalon, and then she heads to Dam Tulian itself in the Vale. Then she heads to Gulliver, which is on the other side of Avalon again, and finally to Lilith, probably named after Lilith, which seems to be on the edge of human space. Her current planet is Croan Deheni, far away from the man realm, 30 years from Avalon. The point is, Sirene has been around. Now of course, her being from the planet Ash is very much intentional, as the order for the burial of the dead has in it, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life. This story has quite a few religious references. In fact, Sirene herself is a stand-in for Jesus. She has 12 apostles, offers resurrection, and has built an obsidian castle where everyone must pass through her house to get to the game. This is in reference to the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "No one comes to the Father except through me." And so the action of our story begins when a cyborg claiming to be Clarin arrives, and he wants Sirene to help him body swap. This cyborg, though, seems to be full robot, with no humanity left in him. Now, from our other stories, we know that Clarin was once a great explorer and the founder of the Academy of Human Knowledge on Avalon. And we know plenty of characters associated with this academy. Jeffrey Lyon and Celise Wan from The Plague Star, and Carolee DeBrannon and his crew from Night Flyers. They were all academics from the academy. Plus Jan Vickery and Gwen Delvano from Dying of the Light studied there. And so we're presented with an interesting dichotomy. Sirene represents religion, while Clarin represents knowledge and science. Anyway, the founding of the Academy on Avalon happened close to 1,000 years ago, so naturally Sirene is a bit skeptical that this cyborg is truly Clarin. She even mocks him by claiming that she's Jesus Christ. So Clarin and Sirene discuss names, and Sirene mentions that people call her Wisdom. Wisdom is a title from Dam Tulian for people who study disciplines related to the mind and body. The cyborg knows this, displaying the fact that he's very well traveled. Of course, we know the title Wisdom from Ice and Fire as well. The alchemists use it, and it's also a rough translation of the title Magi that Miri Mazdur and others hold. So George R. R. Martin seems to be a fan of using the title Wisdom. Anyway, the cyborg has come to play Sirene's body-swapping game. This confuses Sirene, as the cyborg is already immortal. The whole point of the game is to gain life. The cyborg explains that he wants death, as death and life are the same. Sirene believes them to be opposites. Now, this declaration that death and life are the same gets into the entire point of the story, and the metaphor of what the glass flower is, and the nature of the soul, and it also gets into why George R.R. Martin believes that science, atheism, and existentialism are superior to religion. And we'll get to all of this later on. So Sirene tasks her apostles with finding out who the cyborg really is. Now, Sirene says she has 12 apostles, but we only find out about 11 of them. There's Pale Dr. Lyman and the cyborg Daesh Green 9. Sebastian Kale is a liar. That's a species from The Way of Cross and Dragon. Trickner is a Findi mind mute, meaning he's unable to telepathically link with others of his species and is a friendless outcast. Though apparently he still has some telepathic abilities. The Findi were one of the races the humans fought in the Double War, and the aliens who the men of Greywater Station were trying to defeat with their research. So it's kind of neat that we finally get to meet a Findi, and it's kind of sad that we never get to meet a Harangan mind. Anyway, Trickner's crystal-like appearance does remind me of the others a bit. Anyway, there's also Shayela Lothan, who is a neurowhore. I think that means she's a telepath who tries to find out information through sexual suggestion. And there's Brage, who's a drug expert and poisoner. And then there's Cardorian, Sirene's sexual partner and slave collector, who reminds me a bit of Dario. And then there's Ranner, her assistant, and Alta Kanar, her research assistant. And then there's her muscle Jonas, and the winged Anturg Moonscorer, who is really a Catholic from New Rome, another reference to The Way of Cross and Dragon. So the apostles all do their best to try to figure out who this cyborg really is. So I should note that the story's structure goes back and forth between action, that is, everything that has to do with the arrival of the cyborg, and Sirene's thoughts on life, that is, her own history, her views on morality, and mortality. Sirene talks a bit about how morality in the universe is fairly relative. People on the hot world of Ves freeze on Ymir, while people on the cold world of Ymir swelter on Ves. Ves, by the way, is where Father Damien begins his adventures in The Way of Cross and Dragon, and we'll hear about Ymir in the Stone City. Sirene even brings up the morality of the Steel Angels from And Seven Times Never Kill Man. Of course, this discussion of morality is very much Sirene trying to fool herself. Sirene is, simply put, morally horrific. She forces people to swap bodies, which essentially is murder or worse. And then she tries to justify her actions by calling it mere thievery and giving her victims a sliver of a chance at survival. Cardorian even lies to her about who her victims are, especially the pubescent girl that she currently resides in. Her pathetic pseudo-logic reminds me a bit of the Braiths from Dying of the Light, justifying their actions. And Sirene even says she will face death raging. Sirene, though confident and arrogant, really has no morality. She is the abomination that Viramir Sixskins describes and fails to become. And we should remember all of this when we think of Bran and his future with Hodor.
Under the sea, we all eat feces and poop out loaves of bread. I know, ho ho ho.
Patchface, you may be the worst guest we've ever had. So the research comes back and we find out a whole lot of information about Clarin, and we get more background about the Thousand Worlds universe than in any other story. So apparently hundreds and hundreds of years ago during the collapse, Clarin got hurt, was put in cryosleep, and was awoken later and turned into a cyborg because Avalon needed more bodies for work. He rose quite quickly through the ranks because most of the other officers were dead, and then went exploring. Quite significantly, Clarin found a crystal on the planet Eris to hold his memories in. Eris, if you recall, is Royd's surname from Night Flyers. Of course, Royd's mother had her soul put into a crystal just like Clarin. Perhaps the surname Eris comes from this world. Clarin, though, did eventually die, so there is a mystery of who this cyborg really is. This is all intriguing to Sirene, and despite dire warnings from her liar Sebastian, she allows the game to go forward. And so the game begins. Sirene's artifact holds 6 people, so she has 3 prizes and 3 players. Interestingly, Sirene doesn't even mention the names of the prizes. We have a tattooed criminal, a fat brain-fried drug addict, and a winged alien. The players are a sick man named Kramer Delhoon, who may as well be Giles Rosby, and an arrogant adventure seeker named Ricine J, who may as well be Asha, and of course our mysterious cyborg, who claims to be Clarin. And so the game begins and the consciousnesses of the players and Sirene enter a virtual world. Now there should be 7 of them, but an 8th shadowy figure has appeared with them. Now the virtual world is not dissimilar to the Matrix. People have residual self-images, and belief can alter reality, and inversely the reality, even if false, can alter what people believe. And so the players begin to do battle with Kramer the old man going after the tattooed boy, and Ricine the bored thrill-seeker going after the drug addict. Clarin doesn't go after the winged alien, but instead declares his intent to seize Sirene's body. And so Clarin and Sirene do virtual battle, which is mainly about going into their pasts. Clarin did in fact eventually die, and a nameless academic foolishly decided to use Clarin cyborg shell to keep himself alive. The memories of Clarin overwhelmed the soul of the academic, the 8th shadowy figure. And we've heard about souls overpowering each other in Ice and Fire as well. Jojen warns of Summer overpowering Bran, and it does appear that Shaggy Dog may be overpowering Rickon. Orell is still an echo of a soul inside his eagle, even after Varamir Sixskins seizes the eagle. With all of this, we get into a messy abstract question of what the human soul is. Memories? Consciousness? Essence? Free will? If Bran remembers old Nan, is a piece of her alive? Is a piece of her consciousness alive? This gets even messier when we start relating it to existentialism. If one is not accepting one's freedom, is one denying one's own free will and one's essence and perhaps one's consciousness? Now, I'm not saying that George R.R. Martin has made sense of any of this. In fact, he most certainly hasn't. The history of all humanity hasn't figured out what the human soul is. I'm just saying that George R.R. Martin is playing around a bit in his work by conflating consciousness, memory, and the philosophical concept of essence. In fact, I would say all of this relates to what George R. R. Martin thinks a song is.
Under the sea we have memories of shoes, and the shoes all have souls. I know, ho ho ho.
Anyway, Clarin fails to seize Sirene's body, but Sirene decides that she wants the cyborg's body. And so the game ends, and in the aftermath, we find that the tattooed boy has swapped bodies with the winged alien. The winged alien sadly dies by trying to fly in the boy's body. Kramer, the old man, has swapped bodies with the brain-fried drug addict. The addict dies in the old man's skin, while the old man is now dieting and exercising in his new woman's skin. Ricine the adventurer doesn't swap and feels cheated. Clarin and perhaps the echo of the academic are now in Sirene's little girl body, and Clarin is becoming human again. And Sirene is now in the cyborg's body, believing that she is Clarin and wanting to explore the universe. So The Glass Flower is once again a story about existentialism. Existentialists like Heidegger, for example, believe that the creeping specter of death is essential for the human condition of being. All men must die, and by not recognizing this, one is being inauthentic and not understanding the full nature of their freedom, or their free will, or their life's meaning. Now keep in mind, this existentialist belief that death is part of life may not seem so revolutionary now, but it was at odds with thousands of years of Western tradition that thought life and death were opposites. This is, by the way, Sirene's adamant belief. But the existentialist would say no. Infinite nothingness shapes finite being. And it's this that gives people anxiety and causes people to have existential crises. Now, existentialists are rather obsessed with the idea of authenticity. Sirene's glass flower is undying and has no odor and thus is unreal and inauthentic. And this flower is of course a stand-in for the cyborg. A crystal brain with no specter of death is not the human condition. But the definition of authenticity for an existentialist is actually a bit more complicated when it comes to humans. Existentialists tend to believe that living an authentic life is about accepting one's freedom, facing the idea of death, living for oneself rather than according to social norms, and deciding on the meaning of one's own life. Accepting one's freedom is a daunting, daunting challenge. In this sense, the glass flower is also a metaphor for Sirene's existence. She is running from death and living eternally, but not in any sort of free or meaningful way. Her morality is shifty and undefined. She has locked herself up in an obsidian castle, fearing her supposedly conspiring apostles. And to what ends? She's certainly not free. She's not even using her new lives to do anything productive or enjoyable other than occasionally banging Car Dorian. Now, George R.R. Martin goes a bit beyond the philosophy and attaches emotion on the idea of authenticity as well. The cyborg clearly wants to feel again and to have his life have meaning, and Sirene is clearly bored and wants wonderment again, as well as freedom from the anxiety of death. On first read, the body swap seems mutually beneficial, that both parties are gaining freedom. The cyborg's new body allows for real human living, while Sirene's new metallic body offers freedom, eternal life, and a universe to explore. However, if there's one thing that's for certain in a George R.R. Martin story, it's an ambiguous, bittersweet ending. The cyborg, though now human, is still the Mind Lord. He's still choosing to stay on Croandaheny. Why? To body swap further? Despite the new castle design, body swapping is not facing death. He would still be unhappy, unfree, and inauthentic, just as Sirene was. And Sirene, though she insists the memories of Clarin will not overpower her, almost immediately insists that she's Clarin. She almost immediately starts thinking like a machine and losing her humanity. The final line of the story about an insect disappearing into the distance seems to be a metaphor for her diminishing soul. It seems she has suffered the same fate as the nameless academic who joined himself with Clarin. And so perhaps nothing has been really achieved in this story at all. Sirene and the cyborg have simply changed prisons. Neither one of them seems to be really facing death, though I have slightly more hope for the cyborg, who is now a little girl.
Under the sea, we're fading echoes of ourselves, of our...
On a different note, I do think it's interesting that George R. Martin ends the story with a random sense of justice. The old man, who certainly didn't deserve a second life, got one. Our most innocent character, the winged alien, dies a horrible death. Ricine, who wanted to swap desperately, didn't get to, which is rather fitting. The brain-fried drug addict dies, which may or may not be a mercy. The tattooed criminal gets a new winged body, which I'm not certain how I feel about. The swapping of characters is a jumble, and the results are fairly independent of what's just or unjust, much like Ice and Fire so far, and much like real life. The final thing I'd like to talk about is the characters and Christianity. We have talked about Sirene being a stand-in for Jesus, but Clarin also has divine parallels. Of course, he is reborn after dying to become the cyborg, but he could also be seen as the creator or father of the Thousand Worlds universe, as he is the founder of the Academy on Avalon. Additionally, he's filled with unparalleled knowledge and offers eternal life. He too could be seen as Jesus, God, and Heaven. When Sirene becomes Clarin, she is seeking eternal life, but is this a place of eternal peace, or one where her individuality is overwhelmed and lost? This theme will return in A Song for Leah. Now, there is another interpretation of the story that crossed my mind. It may be that Sirene represents traditional religious thought, with life and death being opposites. She is then usurped as Mind Lord by Clarin, an embodiment of science and knowledge that believes death is part of life. Science and knowledge now reign as religion diminishes, at least in the Thousand Worlds universe. And that's all for the glass flower. I'd like to thank Patchface, who's provided us nothing.
Under the sea, we put epistemology before ontology, and phenomenology is made of crabs. I know, ho ho ho.
Next time we'll be talking about the Stone City. The link is below. See you then.